All right, so timing is everything. What exactly does that mean? It sounds like one of those empty cliches you hear from your grandparents, and they can't quite explain the scenario, but timing is everything, just don't worry about it. But if we think about our personal life, I'm sure that we've all had these experiences where things will happen and they just fall into place, right? And things just come together. And when these things usually happen, we attribute them to luck, right? We say it's completely circumstantial. It'll never happen again. I was just in the right place at the right time. And we never take a time to actually sit back and think about time itself. And usually when I bring this up, they're like, well, Lorenzo, really? Like time? How important can time be? Well, today I'm going to share a personal story with you, along with research that was conducted in our lab that suggests that in most cases, time is the most important factor. So when I was 16, I hit this rebellious stage in my life. I knew everything. I didn't like listening to anyone. I didn't like rules. And some people would argue that I still have some residual stubbornness going on today. But at 16, I had it in spades. You couldn't tell me anything. And I decided I would leave my grandparents' place in Chicago, and I would move with my brother here in Green Bay. And here I thought I would be able to get away with all the tempting things teenagers like doing at that age. I'll leave it to your imagination of what those things are. But at 16, I had it all figured out, right? Except I didn't. Moving from Chicago to Green Bay, that is to say from inner city Chicago, all-black school, to an all-white school, was easily the toughest transition I ever made in my life. It was a culture shock. I didn't fit in. I didn't have any friends. And that idea I was going to get away with all the tempting things teenagers did in my brother's house, that didn't quite go as I envisioned either, right? So here I am, I'm contemplating whether the move to Green Bay was even worth it. But again, I knew everything. I had all the answers, right? So I was too proud to admit that I made a mistake. But they say pain can teach you a lesson that pride just won't let you learn. And so I slipped into a depression, and as a result, my grades suffered. I was always in the principal's office, and as these behaviors kind of escalated, I was on the verge of being dismissed from school. And this was one of the darkest times of my life. I just remember desperately wanting the day to end and just never start again in the morning. And just as my life began to spiral out of control, the school psychologist at Preble stepped in to lend a hand. She sat me in her office, and I remember her telling me how smart I was and how much potential I had. And I remember thinking, they must pay you a lot of money to say these things. And I don't know how much she made, but I do know one thing. If the other students she had to deal with were even half as bad as I was, she had her work cut out for her every day. And in that case, she was worth her weight in gold. I mean, I don't even know that you can pay me to deal with myself back in those days. But nevertheless, she diligently worked with me to get me back on track to graduate. So my grades started to improve. Visits to the principal office became less frequent. And I just remember thinking about, she got me back on track to graduate. I was able to graduate. I was subsequently admitted into UWGB. And even to this day, I think about the impeccable timing of her efforts and how drastically different my life would look had she not stepped in at that particular time. And in no small part, due to her efforts, I was able to graduate from UWGB with a psychology degree. And today I stand before you as a PhD student in neuroscience at Washington University in St. Louis. Understanding how important time was for me early in my life, I decided I wanted to study with Dr. Eric Herzog, a world-renowned circadian biologist. And this is actually a field of research that's actually been getting a lot of coverage lately. The three scientists that unraveled and discovered the mechanism that controls circadian rhythms were awarded the 2017 Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine. But what are circadian rhythms? Well, when you first hear it, you think of sleep, and rightfully so. sleep is a circadian rhythm. But more generally defined, circadian rhythms can be anything, any behavior or physiological, biological process that follows a 24-hour cycle. Okay, so things like body temperature, digestion, hormone secretion, these are all things that are regulated on a 24-hour cycle, and they would all be considered circadian. So how does this actually play out? So now you've probably heard of this idea that one of the easiest ways to lose weight is to simply not eat 2 to 3 hours before you go to bed, right? So if you don't want to change your diet and you don't want to exercise, one of the ways to lose weight is you can just not eat before you go to bed, a few hours before you go to bed. And part of the reason that this is true is because your metabolism is actually regulated on a circadian cycle, a 24-hour cycle. And so calories that are consumed right before you go to bed are actually more likely to be stored as fat. Right? So that's just one example of how circadian rhythms play out in our everyday life. But you may be wondering, how is it that these circadian rhythms are regulated in all these tissues and organs throughout the body? Well, as it turns out, you have these clock genes whose main function is to simply generate 24-hour cycles. So the cycle that we see on the board is a 24-hour feedback loop, okay? And we can measure the activity of this loop, and when we plot it, we get a nice oscillating rhythm, right? And this is what takes place in every cell in your body. And as researchers, we can go in and we can genetically delete the clock genes, and when we do that, the rhythm is gone. And so this 24-hour cycle is happening in every cell in your body, and it keeps track of time. And it's what ultimately regulates behavior and physiology. So if we were to think about sleep for a second, around 9 p.m., the pineal gland up in the brain secretes this hormone, melatonin, and it's implicated in sleep. And it starts to be secreted as you go to bed, and then it peaks in the middle of the night. And then it comes down, and as its levels come down, it promotes wakefulness, and it's what gets you up out of bed. And this, you repeat the cycle every day if we were to measure the activity. And this is what's responsible for generating your sleep-wake cycle. Unless you're a college student, of course, and there's some other things that generate your sleep-wake cycle. But this is, generally speaking, this is what goes on in every cell in your body that gives it an optimal time of day for functioning, like body temperature and hormone secretion. So the question our lab wanted to look at was, does this same timekeeping system that takes place in every cell in your body, does it provide us a window of opportunity for treating diseases that affect these various organs? So in neuroscience, we study the most fascinating organ in the human body, I think. And in particular, we study glioblastoma. And you may have heard this in the news recently because this is the same disease that Senator John McCain has. And it's the most common and aggressive brain cancer in adults. There's about 9,000 new cases each year. And it's as a sign of how aggressive it is, patients, once they are diagnosed with this disease, they usually succumb and pass away within a year to 15 months. So again, our lab wanted to know, does the timekeeping system that's in these glioblastoma cancer cells, does it provide us a window of opportunity for treatment? So we approached this problem the exact same way I explained earlier. We were able to measure the clock activity in these cancer cells. And what we did was we took a chemotherapy drug, TMZ, which kills glioblastoma cells. And what we did was we treated and once we clocked this activity, we treated at the falling phase, at the trough, at the rising phase, and at the peak. And so the question is, if we treat at different times of day with the same concentration, is the drug more effective at killing these cancer cells? So when we measured the cell death, what we saw was, indeed, the drug actually was more effective at killing these cancer cells at the trough of the circadian cycle. So then remember I told you earlier that we can genetically delete the clock genes, right? Essentially breaking the clock in these cells. And we repeated these experiments. And now the question becomes, if we render these cells timeless, they have no sense of time, they don't know what time of day it is, and we treat at the same times as in the previous treatment, does it still display a time-dependent sensitivity. So no surprise, when we knocked out the clock gene in these cells, the circadian rhythm is gone, not surprising. But then when we looked at its effectiveness, it no longer had this time-dependent sensitivity, suggesting that this chemotherapy drug does act in a time-dependent manner. This has huge implications. The chemotherapy drugs that we use to treat cancer, they kill cancer cells, but they also kill healthy cells, and they're usually toxic for the patient. And the idea is that with this research, what we're showing is that the tools to treat these deadly diseases may be right in front of us, sitting right in front of us, but maybe we should consider the time in which we use them. And this is actually research that's now been published, and it's actually in the phase of clinical trials. And now we're trying to find out if we can improve the quality of life or the outcomes of patients that are suffering from glioblastoma, one of the most aggressive brain cancers in existence. So you asked me, Lorenzo, how important do you think time is? Well, even if it's something as simple as falling asleep at night, to restoring hope and rescuing a child from inner city Chicago, all the way up to something extreme like treating a deadly malignant brain cancer. Timing is everything. Thank you.